Hello, hello. Okay. All right, it's 4 o'clock, so let's go and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? We're staying cool. It's been really hot, but we got some rain today, which apparently is a forewarning for things to come. So apparently we have a big hurricane that's coming our way, and so we have extreme heat and then extreme storms, and so just another day in California where Mother Nature's trying to kill you. And so, okay, so so today is going to be kind of the last day in our series of what I call like tissue biomechanics. And so we're going to talk about joints today, right? So we just finished talking about muscles. Before that, we talked about bones. And so joints are kind of the last thing that we need to talk about before we start doing some actual biomechanics computations starting next week. Okay. All right. So homework 1, reminder, homework 1 is due tonight by 11:59. And so I know quite a few of you have turned it in already. And so if you already, thank you very much. But if you haven't yet, just remember the deadline tonight is 11:59. If you would prefer to turn in a hard copy, you can turn it in at the end of lecture today. I'll go ahead and collect them up here. If not, you can just upload a PDF on your PDF onto Canvas. Okay, and homework 2. So I did finish writing up homework 2, so that'll be up probably later tonight, maybe after the lecture today, and that will be due, I want to say, in 2 weeks, and so you'll have a bit more time to do that one. Just because I want to make sure that we can finish covering some parts of next week before that homework. Okay, so that's all my announcements. And so are there any questions I can answer before we get started today? Okay, all right, so let's go and get started. And so today we're talking about joint biomechanics. Okay. And so the joints of your body are essentially just whenever you have 2 bones meeting up together. Okay, so they're the locations when 2 bones meet up. Okay. And the geometry of the bones at the joints play a big role in determining, what kinds of movements are allowed in your body. And so think of it like 2 mechanical parts kind of meeting up together in the same place, right? So depending on how they fit together, that determines the type of movement that they can do and the type of actions that can be performed at that joint. Okay. And so, you have lots of different types of joints in your body, and they all play a very important role. But joints are also important because they're also, very frequent sites of injury. I'd say probably compared to bones and compared to muscles on their own, people get injured at their joints the most. Okay. Because what you'll see later on today is that, for joints where the fit between the bones isn't super tight, you have these special tissues in your body called ligaments. And so the ligaments are another type of soft tissue that are meant to hold the bones together at your at your joints, okay? But these ligaments are not really as strong as bones. And so what can happen a lot is that people will stretch these ligaments, they'll tear these ligaments, and they lead to a lot of pain and a lot of injuries, right? And so when you think of like athletic injuries, one thing that you hear a lot is, injuries at the ankle, right? And so, I think if you played basketball or any kind of sport, you probably rolled your ankle at some point, and it's very painful depending on, how much you roll it. But what's happening underneath is that, your ankle joint, it's held together by a lot of these ligaments. And so you damage those ligaments, then you damage the joint as well. Okay? And so you're going to see that a lot. Another idea that we're going to go over today is this idea of stability at the joints and flexibility at the joints. Right, and so these are basic characteristics of the joint. Speaking of injuries, that determine, how likely is it for those joints to be injured, right? And so a relatively stable joint is not going to be injured that much, whereas one that's more flexible might give you more range of motion, but also you're more likely to get injured. Okay, so that's kind of just a general overview for today. And so we're going to go over all of these ideas, just so that you have kind of a good appreciation for the joints. Okay? All right, and as an example, and so I think I mentioned this earlier, in earlier weeks, the hip joint, I think, is probably the most beautiful design joint in the human body. And so when you talk about the hip joint, you're talking about the joint that forms between your thigh bone or your femur and your pelvic bone. Okay? And so I'm do a really bad job of this, but I'm going to try my best to draw it. Okay? And so your femur or your thigh bone looks something like this. Okay? And so kind of the defining characteristic of your thigh bone is that it has this, this spherical head. Okay. And that head fits perfectly into a socket into your pelvic bone. And so what you have is a very, very stable joint, because you have, the head of the femur that fits, so well into the pelvic bone. And so it actually grants you a lot of range of motion. And so, your hip, you can move in lots of different ways, right? And so, we call it a ball and socket joint because it's literally a ball fit within a socket, right? And so you can kind of twist and turn that in many different ways. Yet, despite all the flexibility that it gives you, it's probably the most stable joint in the body. Okay. And so out of all the joints in your body, your hip is probably the one that's one of the least likely to get injured because of how stable it is, right? And you almost never hear about people dislocating their hip because the thigh bone just fits so well into that. Okay? Yet despite that, it just gives you so much range of motion. It undergoes so much stress because it's a weight bearing joint. It's just it's very nice. It's very nicely designed compared to a lot of other joints in your body, especially if you compare that to your shoulder joint, which is not so well designed. Okay. So I had to put that in there just because I think it's good to see an example of a joint, but I just really appreciate the design of this joint. All right. Any questions on this so far? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the different types of joints that are found in the body. And so there's actually lots of different types of joints. And so I think when people think of joints, they think of, the parts, the joints where you can actually move, move your body parts, okay, the joints that have movement. But there's actually a lot of joints in your body that don't move. Because, the joint is basically just whenever you have two bones that come together, right? And so it's very rare in your body that you have two bones that come together and there's no kind of supporting structure to them, okay? And so you actually have a lot of joints that are called immovable joints. Right? And so these type of joints, just like its name, allow very little movement between the connecting bones, if at all. Okay. And oftentimes they're covered in this kind of very fibrous kind of structure, very fibrous cartilage that kind of helps keep it in place. Okay. And so these types of joints here are mostly just designed for absorbing and attenuating any kind of impact or any kind of force. Okay. So some examples of these types of joints in your body, they would be like the joints between the different skull plates. Okay. Okay. And so remember we talked about before, your skull actually isn't just one big bone, it's actually comprised of different plates. And so the joints in between those are considered immovable because there's no reason why, you would need to move the bones in your skull around. Okay. Another example of these would be like the joints in between your rib cage. Right. So joints, joints that are there because they have to exist between distinct bones, but they're not designed to move. Okay. So that's the first type of joint. And so then we have all the joints that are designed for movement, and there are quite a few of these. I'm not going to go over all of them just in this for the sake of time, but I do want to go over some of the few main ones that are important. Okay. And so the first type of joint we'll go over is a hinge joint. Okay. And so in these in these types of joints, the articulating bones or the bones that comprise the joint, they kind of form a hinge. Okay. Okay. And usually what you'll see is that one surface, one surface of the bone, like one bone surface is going to be mostly convex and the other surface is mostly concave. Okay, so that helps form the hinge. So there's a lot of examples of these in the body, but I think the ones that kind of fit this description the best are actually the joints in between your finger bones. Okay? And so if you look at your finger bones, these are probably the most perfect example of the hinge joint in your body, because you can't really move your fingers kind of side to side, and they mostly just kind of curl just like a hinge. Okay? But of course, other examples would be like your elbow. Your elbow is a good example of a hinge joint. Your knee, technically it's a hinge joint because it can only move as a hinge, but the knee is actually quite complicated. So we'll come back to the knee a bit later in the class today. Okay. And so another type of joint is a pivot joint. Okay. And so a pivot joint only allows rotation around a singular axis. Okay. And so a good example of a pivot joint would be like your wrist. Okay. And so your wrist is actually, more complex than just that. And so your wrist can have hinge motion as well, but your wrist can also rotate like a pivot. Okay. And so your wrist is actually quite complex, but it's also considered a pivot joint. Okay. And the fourth one, and so there's more in the notes if you're curious. And so there's kind of, I'm hitting kind of the extremes of the types of joints that you can see. But there's a lot of joints that are kind of in between these that don't offer as much range of motion, but are in between these examples. Okay? And so the last type of joint that I want to go over is very similar to the hip joint, or it is like the hip joint, which is a ball and socket joint. And so in these types of joints, the articulating bones, one of them is spherical and the other is concave. And so they make a very nice kind of mating pair. Okay. And the ball and socket joint allows the greatest degree of freedom or movement degrees of freedom than all the other joints. And so generally speaking, you are allowed to have rotation in all three principal points. And of course, an example of this would be like the hip joint, or the shoulder joint is also a good example of this too. Okay. And so, characterizing a joint's motion according to one of these types is really important because that gives you, that informs you how that joint is designed to move. Okay. A joint that moves in a certain way that it's not designed to be often will lead to injuries, right? And so, take your finger, for example, okay? And so your finger is designed to just be like a hinge joint to kind of bend forward just like this. But if you take your finger and then bend it sideways like that, I'm not actually going to do it because I'm not actually interested in breaking my finger. But if you do that, you're likely going to get an injury because your finger is not designed to bend that way. Right? Okay. And so if you move a joint in a way that it's not supposed to, you're probably going to get hurt one way or the other. And I also want to mention too that these categories here make it seem like every joint kind of belongs strictly to one category, but that's also not the case either. And so there's a lot of joints that kind of are mostly one type, but they can allow a little movement in another type as well. Okay, so these categories are not strict. They're not strict categories. Okay. Right, so one good example of that is your knee. And so your knee is mostly a hinge joint. And so it's mostly designed to work just as a hinge, but you do have a little bit of lateral and medial movement as well in the knee, depending on how flexible your ligaments are. And so, it does, your knee mostly is a hinge, but then it can move in other ways as well. All right, any questions on this? Okay, so let's go over the idea of joint stability. So one of the primary injury concerns that we have for the joints is, if the bones kind of pop out of the joint, right? So we call those dislocations. And so whenever you have we call bone dislocation, what's happening is the bone that's supposed to be in the joint kind of pops out of it. Okay. And so stability, we can use this idea of stability to describe how well a particular joint can resist dislocations. Okay. Because generally dislocations is something that you don't want to do, unless you're at a party and everyone's getting drunk and you want to show off to someone, then, in most cases, you don't want to dislocate your bones. Okay. Because oftentimes if you dislocate the bones, you run the risk of damaging a lot of the tissue that's occurring at the joint, mostly the ligaments. And so those are, long-term injuries that usually take some time to heal. Okay. And so a stable joint is a good joint. And so you generally want stability in your joints. Okay. And so there's a lot of factors that go into, to determining joint stability. Okay. And so some of the factors that contribute to it are Number one, number one factor I think is the shape of the articulating bones. And so the two bones that come to the joint, how are they shaped relative to each other? Right, so that's the one we'll focus on mostly in this class. But another factor could also be the arrangement and the strength of the soft tissue, mostly like the ligaments and the tendons around that joint as well. Okay. So let's talk about factor one a bit. And so, when I say the shape of the articulating bones, a stable joint is going to have bones that fit together really, really well, right? And so just like the hip bone. And so the hip bone is almost like a perfect match because you have, a very spherical femur, and then you have the perfect socket in the pelvic, in the pelvic bone, right? And so those two shapes are very well aligned to each other. Which is great to say, I think, maybe qualitatively. But if we wanted to talk about this kind of more quantitatively in terms of something we can actually compute, the biggest factor that determines how well two bones fit together is how much contact area that they have. Okay? Okay. So generally, the more contact area that you have, the more stable your joint is going to be, because that's how your joint kind of resists any kind of dislocation. Because if the other bone is blocking it due to them making contact, then that's going to lead to stability. Okay. So we've already talked about the hip joint, but let's talk about the joint that it gets compared to a lot, which is the shoulder joint. And so the shoulder joint is it kind of has the same idea as the hip joint. And so just like the hip, it's a ball and socket joint where you have a lot of range of motion in your shoulder. And so, you can move your arm in lots of different ways because the shoulder joint is designed to be a ball and socket. Okay. But unlike the hip joint, your shoulder joint here actually has very little contact area. And so remember, if we go back to the hip joint up here, right, we have this very, very large, we call it the femoral head, right? The femoral head is one of the biggest bony structures in your body. And you have a very, very deep socket in the pelvic bone, right? So your pelvic bone forms a very nice kind of concave socket for it to fit into. The shoulder is not like that at all. And so instead of a femoral head, your upper arm bone here is called your humerus. Okay. And part of that is due to the fact that your humerus or your arm bone is just much smaller than your thigh bone. Your thigh bone is literally the biggest bone in your body. And so, the fact that you have a smaller head means that you're just naturally going to have a much smaller contact area. Okay. But I think that's not the biggest issue that the shoulder has. The bigger issue is that, your humerus is attaching to your shoulder bone, which is called your scapula. Okay. Okay. And so to form your shoulder joint, your humerus is attaching to your scapula, your shoulder bone, but it doesn't have like a good socket to fit into. And so if you look at the anatomy, and I'm going to do my best to draw it, but it's not going to be good. It's not actually a socket at all. It's kind of just like a small like a small divot, they call it. And so it's like just a very shallow kind of ditch where the arm bone kind of fits into. Okay. Right. And so you have a situation where you have a much smaller bone and a very shallow socket. And so you have a joint that's a lot less stable than your hip. Okay. And so shoulder dislocations are actually very, very common, especially relative to hip dislocations. And I keep telling myself that I need to get an x-ray to confirm this, but I think I have an especially unstable shoulder joint because I feel like if I just stretch the wrong way, like if I just pull my arm back like this, I feel like I dislocate my shoulder just by pure accident. And I have to I panic a little bit because my shoulder's dislocated and then I got to kind of pop it back. And so, yeah, I'm very careful with my shoulders so they don't dislocate. And in fact, you probably know a person, who is shown off at some party where alcohol may be involved, that they can dislocate their shoulder at will and then pop it back in, and then it's not painful for them, right? And so the reason they can do that is the shoulder is just not a very stable joint. So I can try to draw it. And so your humerus, the head of your humerus kind of looks something like this. And so it doesn't form like a very nice sphere like the femur does, but it does its best. Okay? And your scapula kind of looks like this. Okay. And so it doesn't actually form a deep socket, like I said, but it forms like a small divot. Right. And so there's a very shallow place for the humerus to kind of barely fit in there. And so you have very little contact area, which is why the shoulder joint is so unstable. Okay. But at the same time, we kind of need that too, because your shoulder, we require so much range of motion in our shoulder just to go about our daily activities. And so the fact that it's not stable kind of allows us to have that range of motion at the cost of safety, of course. All right. And so that's kind of the definition of stability. And so, the one that we'll focus on the most is contact area, especially in the coming weeks, but, that's what we can talk about. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. And so the good thing is, or maybe not so good thing, is that the contact area that your bones experience at the joints is not a constant thing. So you can actually do stuff with your body and with your muscles to increase or decrease the contact area at your joints. And so there's certain ways that you kind of arrange the bones at your joints to make sure that they're more stable or not. Okay. And it all kind of goes back to this idea of contact area. And so if you move your body parts in a certain way where the contact area is maximized, and that's what we call a more stable position, or the more the technical term for it is we call it closed pack position. And the opposite of a closed pack position is a loose pack position, which is one where the contact area is minimized, which lowers stability. Okay. And so a good example of this happening in your body is at your ankle joint. Okay. And so your ankle joint already is a joint where people get injured a lot. But there are certain positions that your foot can have that will put you at more or less risk of injury. Okay. And so let's consider kind of the two main positions. And so we have dorsiflexion. Okay. Remember, this is the position that you take when you're trying to point your toes up towards your head. Okay. Looks like an elf shoe. Okay. And so in this position, scientists did some studies about what the average area of contact is. Okay. And so on average, when your foot is in the dorsiflexion position, your contact area is about 7.34 plus or minus 1.69 centimeters square. Okay. You compare that to the opposite position, which is plantar flexion. Okay. Remember, plantar flexion is when you're pointing your toes down towards the ground. Okay. That was more horrible than usual. Try again. Still not great, but it's okay. Okay, so when you're in plantar flexion, what scientists have found is that the contact area is around 4.39 plus or minus 1.31 centimeters square. Okay, so it's a big difference. And so, between dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, you have much less contact area in plantar flexion. Okay. Yeah.
For the dorsal flexion, that's 7.8.
7.34. And so this tells us that your ankle is at a much bigger risk of injury in the plantar flexion orientation, right? And so when your foot is pointed down, your toes are pointed down, you're much more likely to get injured than if your toes are pointed out. Right? And if you play basketball, this is probably consistent with what you with what you know, right? Because a lot of times people roll their ankles when they're going up, they're jumping up for a rebound or something, right? And so you jump up, and so naturally when you jump up, your toes are pointed down because you just finished kind of jumping up. And if you kind of land awkwardly where you twist your ankle, you're much more likely to get injured in those cases. And so, this lines up with kind of anecdotal evidence of, at least, for people who played basketball before. Okay. Right. And so generally the idea is that, the difference between closed pack positions and loose pack positions is that, if you're acting in a certain way, or your muscles are acting in a way that pushes your joint together, or so in other words, there's a compressive force at your joints, that's going to give you more stability because you're literally pushing the bones together and you're increasing the contact area. Okay? Okay. And so, of course, the opposite is true as well. And so, if you apply forces that kind of pull the joint further apart, then that's going to decrease stability. Okay. And so this is such an important concept that it'll kind of be our focus for the next few weeks. Okay. And so what we'll see is that we're going to do some calculations where we're going to look at the human body in certain positions, and we're going to compute what the reaction forces are at the joints. Okay. Okay. And so depending on the direction and the magnitude of those joint reaction forces, then we can say from our calculations whether this is going to put the person at a higher injury risk or a lower injury risk, at least in terms of their joints. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. And so that's joint stability. Okay. I do want to talk about kind of one very special joint in the body, and it kind of goes along with the soft tissue point I was making earlier, and that's the knee joint. Okay. So the knee joint is actually quite special because the knee joint stability, a lot of it is actually not determined by the bones because the bones are actually quite a bad fit. And so your knee joint actually has a very complex network of ligaments that hold it together. Okay. Okay. And so your knee joint looks kind of something like this. And so you have now we're looking at the bottom of the femur. Okay. And so it kind of makes this almost like cartoony kind of bone shape, okay, like that. And then on the bottom, you have your tibia, which kind of forms this platform. Like this. Okay, so this right here is your femur, which again is your thigh bone. And then this is your tibia, which is one of the bones in your lower leg. Okay, so the other bone is the fibula, but the fibula doesn't contribute to the knee joint. And so we're just going to look at the tibia. Okay. All right, and so if you look at these two bones, right, so we have one that's kind of forms this kind of dual pronged shape, and the other one's just kind of a flat platform. Normally, this is a very poor fit between bones, and so you compare this to the hip bone, the most beautiful joint in the body. This is nowhere even close to that because you don't have any kind of surfaces, and so you can imagine if you take these two, it's like taking two markers, right, and then trying to fit them together, right? They don't actually fit together because their shapes don't actually match up. Right? And so to make sure that your knees don't just, get demolished whenever you take a step, you have this network of ligaments, okay? So let me go ahead and draw those in. So we have two ligaments on the outside, just like this. And so, we're going to assume that, say you're looking at this person, kind of straight on, we're looking at their, we're looking at their right leg, okay? And so on one side we have the LCL, which is I'll go ahead and define that in a second. This one right here is called MCL. And then we have the two ligaments on the interior that kind of cross over like this. Okay? So one of these is called the ACL. And the other one is called the PCL. It's a little bit hard to draw here, but the ACL kind of crosses from forward to back, and the PCL crosses from back to forward. All right, so let me go ahead and define these ligaments. Okay, so the LCL stands for the lateral ligament. The key word for that is lateral, right? So remember the difference between lateral and medial. So lateral means it's on the outside of your body. Medial is on the inside or closer to the midline. Okay, so the MCL. Okay, so the MCL is the medial collateral ligament. See? Okay. And then we have the two cruciate ligaments. Okay. And so these ligaments are named because they form a cross in the middle of your knee. So we have the ACL, which is the anterior cruciate ligament. Okay. And then the PCL, which is the posterior cruciate ligament. And so your knee depends on these four ligaments primarily to make sure that it stays stable and your knee doesn't slide off from the rest of your body. Okay. And so they all play an important role. And so they all prevent a certain kind of motion that's dangerous to your knee. Okay. And so the LCL, for instance, the LCL and the MCL kind of play a role and make sure your knee doesn't buckle kind of side to side, right? And so you have a little bit of lateral and medial movement in your knee, but it's not that much because of the MCL and the LCL, right? And so the one that tends to get injured the most between the LCL and the MCL is actually the MCL. Okay, because what the MCL helps to do is that it helps prevent kind of excessive medial bending of your knee. Okay, and so this can happen a lot if you sustain an impact on the side of your knee. Okay, and so let's say that you're walking and someone just shoots a football and it hits you kind of on the outside of your knee. Okay, and so the natural thing is that your knee is going to kind of buckle inward. And so to make sure that that doesn't buckle too much is the MCL. Okay. Okay. And so you'll see the MCL kind of hurt a lot in contact sports, like in football, because if you're getting a tackle, at the knees, and it causes your knee to buckle, and then it might cause your MCL to get hurt. Okay. Your ACL is probably the other one that you've heard gets injured a lot. Right, so your ACL and your PCL, they play the role to help prevent your knee from sliding kind of forward and back. Okay, and so your ACL often gets injured when oftentimes when you plant your foot in order to change direction. Okay, and so in sports that require you to cut very sharply, or if you're going to change direction very sharply, that puts a lot of strain on your ACL and your PCL. And the one that gets strained, that gets injured much more, is the ACL. Okay, just kind of based on how people make cuts, when they're walking or running. Okay. Okay. So, it is possible to injure your LCL and your PCL, but those are quite uncommon, and you'd probably have to do something pretty unnatural in terms of your movement or in terms of the situation that you're in to injure those ligaments. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. And so your knee, I think, is the primary example of a joint that's held together by these soft tissues. A lot. The other one is your ankle. Your ankle is another example of this kind of joint. Okay. And so you might be asking, what's the difference in terms of, joints that are mostly that get most of their stability from the bony surfaces versus one like this, which gets it from the ligaments. Okay. The main difference is that these ligaments, they're literally just like supporting cables inside your body. And just like any material, they can get fatigued easily. Okay. Right. And so, just like any material, when a material gets fatigued, they lose a lot of their structural properties. And so, maybe a force that they could have withstood if they were at full strength, if they're fatigued just by overusing it, then they might sustain an injury or a tear. Okay. The other difference is that, you know, when you're talking about ligament stability, you know, when your ligament is actually doing work to keep your joint stable, it's often in tension actually. Okay. And so that's different from like pushing two bony surfaces together through compression, right? And so when the ligament's doing its job, it's being stretched. And so think of like a supporting cable for like a suspension bridge or something like that, right? So when that supporting cable, when it needs to be working because it's sustaining a lot of weight, that cable is in tension. So ligaments are kind of the same way. Okay. So that's kind of a fundamentally kind of different way to provide stability rather than pushing two kind of harder surfaces together. Okay. So that's kind of an important distinction I want to make. You know, joints which gain much of their stability just kind of based on the geometry of the bones. So we call those kind of more bony joints. Whereas joints like these, which get a lot of their stability from the ligaments. And so, you know, in the end, you know, you're going to have stable joints either way. It's just kind of how they get their stability, and you know what activities going to put them at risk are different depending on, you know, whether they're bony or more ligament stable. All right, any questions on these? Okay. All right, so for the last 15 minutes today, I want to talk about just common injuries that you'll see at the joints, and then we'll wrap up this unit. All right. So we've been talking about, you know, injuries of the joints kind of this whole day, but, you know, let's actually, you know, describe some common ones and actually what's happening to your tissues under each of these different injuries. Okay. All right. So the first one is a sprain. This is one probably you've heard a lot. Okay. And so a sprain is basically a damage to the ligaments or tendons or any of the soft tissue. Okay? Okay. And these are often caused when you have any kind of abnormal or excessive movement or twisting or displacement of the articulating bones of the joints. Okay. So one clear example of this is rolling your ankle, right? So when you roll your ankle, that's a very excessive movement of your ankle. Oftentimes it's kind of you kind of roll it in a certain way. And so that's a very excessive movement that your ankle is not designed to do. So that puts a lot of strain. It puts a lot of stress on the ligaments that hold your ankle together. And if it gets to a point where your ligaments can't withstand that force, then they sustain some damage. Either it might be just a small tear, or it might be a complete tear in kind of the worst case. And so all of those are characterized as sprains. Okay? But because, there's different severities of sprains that you can sustain, we can characterize them as like first degree, second degree, or third degree sprains, depending on how bad the tissue damage is. Okay. All right, next we have dislocations. And so dislocations, we've already mentioned, but dislocations are when you have any kind of displacement of the bones at an articulating joint that's not supposed to happen. Okay? And so oftentimes, we describe a dislocation as like a bone popping out of its joint. And so that's kind of really what it is. And so every joint has a designed way for the bones to fit together. And so if you ever reach a point where the bone is not fitting together at the joint, then that's a dislocation. Okay. All right, so where are these most common? So these are most common in the shoulders, the fingers, the knees, and the elbows. And what's bad about dislocation, so your bones themselves have quite not that many pain sensors. And so if your bone dislocates, it's not your bone that's usually crying out in pain. But usually if a bone pops out of its joint, a lot of times it's kind of ripping through and damaging a lot of the tissues around that. So things like ligaments, things like muscle tissue, things like blood vessels. So all of these become damaged when a bone just suddenly just starts popping into their homes, right? And so if you ever do get a dislocation, generally you're going to want to relocate your bone. So don't just leave it out there. But at the same time, and if you've taken any kind of safety training, don't oftentimes it's a bad idea to try to relocate your bone by yourself. And so it's often best to wait for a medical professional to pop that back into place, because there are ways that you can pop your bone back and actually do more damage than good. Okay. Because you want to make sure when you pop it back in the right position. You don't want to pop it back in the wrong position and then kind of, mess up your joint for the rest of your life. Okay, so that's dislocations. All right. So I'd say, those two are the main injuries that you can sustain by kind of external factors. And so by, doing some kind of crazy movement or playing some kind of, contact sport. The next two are kind of more internal. So these are things that can develop within your body that, that the thing that you do play an impact in terms of these developing, but it's not as acute or it's not as direct as the other two. So the first is a condition called bursitis. And so a bursitis is basically inflammation of these things called bursa. Okay? And so we haven't talked about bursa yet. And so bursa, that's how you spell it. So bursa are these kind of fluid-filled sacs that are within a lot of the joints in your body, and they kind of act as cushions or shock absorbers for a lot of these joints. Okay. Right. And so what can happen sometimes that these bursa, because they're made of tissue in your body, they can become irritated and inflamed. Okay? And so some of the symptoms of bursitis could be, when you're moving joints past each other, you feel a lot of pain. Okay. And so, it literally feels like, when you're moving a joint, it feels like you're rubbing against something that's causing a lot of pain. And bursitis is caused a lot by repetitive overuse impacts on the bursa. And so if you kind of load the bursa a lot and you subject it to a lot of kind of repeated impacts, then that can cause them to become irritated. Okay. All right, and so the last kind of injury that you can get at your joints, and if you watch any kind of daytime television like Price is Right, you probably heard advertising for medicines to help with this, and so that's arthritis. So arthritis is actually not just one thing. So arthritis is kind of an umbrella term to to refer to a lot of different conditions that can happen at the joint. But it's just used to describe any kind of inflamed tissue or tissue inflammation that's occurring at the joints. Okay. And so this is separate from bursitis. And so bursitis is specifically inflammation of the bursa at your joints, but other tissue inside your joints can also become inflamed as well. Okay, so that's arthritis. And so, this is extremely common. And so a lot of people will start to experience arthritis as they get older. Okay. But there's also certain types. Okay? So I'll go over kind of the two most common ones that you hear about the most. Okay? And so the first one is rheumatoid arthritis. Okay. And so in rheumatoid arthritis, this is actually kind of it's for as much as it's talked about on TV, it's actually kind of a scary disease. And so when you have rheumatoid arthritis, the immune system inside your body actually starts to attack the tissue at your joints, causing them to become inflamed and irritated. Okay. Okay. So that's probably the one you hear on TV the most, because you can actually take medicines to help kind of treat this, because it's not a mechanical injury. It's not something that you're going out and injuring yourself, doing movement. It's actually something wrong with your immune system. And so you can take drugs to kind of suppress that and help with this disease. Okay. And the other type of arthritis that we'll go over is osteoarthritis. You guys have a question out there? And so osteoarthritis is a degenerative condition where the cartilage in your joints actually starts to wear down with time. And so we're not going to get to talk about it today, but cartilage actually plays a very important role in your joints too, because a lot of the joint surfaces in your body are covered in cartilage, mostly just because of its properties. And so it's relatively hard, and so it can withstand some pain, but it's also very smooth. And so what's very important at your joints is that the bones that actually comprise the joints, they actually move past each other very smoothly. And so you don't have a lot of friction at your joints. And cartilage plays a big role in making sure that it kind of minimizes friction as much as possible. And so when this cartilage starts to break down as you get older, then it can cause a lot of pain, because then you have more kind of bone on bone contact. Okay. And last I checked, and so I haven't been diving into the literature too much lately, but last I checked, osteoarthritis is still being researched in terms of what's causing it and what are the best ways to reverse it. And so that's one thing that's doctors are still kind of working on to this day. All right, any final questions on any of this? Okay, all right, so that's all we got time for today. And so that kind of closes this kind of bigger chapter on tissue biomechanics. And so next week, on the first day next week, we're going to do a brief review of mechanics, mostly free body diagrams and how do we do static analysis. And then on Thursday, we'll actually start getting into examining the different parts of your body and their biomechanics. And so we'll start with the upper extremity, which is your arms, your shoulders, and things like that, and then move on to the legs and the spine. Okay. So have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in on Zoom. Stay cool. I did that last time too. Stay cool, because it's a heat wave. But apparently we have a big hurricane coming, so stay dry as well. So don't let Mother Nature kill you this weekend, and then, that'll be good for next week, right? So have a great weekend. I'll see you guys next Tuesday.